IBM's PS2 line was the follow-up to the original PC, and it's an incredibly interesting mix of innovative technology and questionable business strategy. While that's all fodder for a video in itself, today I'm here to finally get my own interesting example of the PS2, this portable P70, finally restored to fully working order, cleaned up, and of course I'm going to demo it for you. So let's go! My P70 is a 386DX20 with 8 MB of RAM and a 387 coprocessor. A quick recap. When I bought this machine, it booted once with errors that indicated the CMOS battery was dead. I replaced the battery, but the system never booted again, instead giving me error messages about a system misconfiguration. But it wouldn't boot the required reference disk, and never even got to the screen demanding it either. I even tried to put the original dead battery back in, to no avail. So I ended that video on kind of a frustrating note. However, there was more going on with this P70 than even I could imagine in that first video. Sinister doings were afoot. Many of my own commenters suggested that the floppy drive capacitors needed replacing, and when I looked at the drive, those capacitors literally fell off in my hand. So yes, I'd say my commenters were right. The board itself had electrolyte leaked all over it, and some of the tracings looked pretty bad. I cleaned everything up and tested the tracings with a multimeter. Everything seemed okay, so I went ahead with a recap. Of course, I cleaned the heads too, as long as I was in there. I bought new capacitors in both SMD and radial formats, with the radials the backup because I've never done SMD before. However, it turned out that SMD were actually quite a bit easier for me. Why was I ever afraid of this? But the electrolyte that had leaked onto the board had damaged at least one of the pads and made it impossible to use. In the end, I replaced all the caps at least once, but some twice, and I ended up having to go with one radial cap because its pad had detached from the board, and I needed the long legs to get it to its final destination. The other pads and tracings seemed in okay condition, not great, but usable. I put the drive back in the machine and got the same result. No boot, and not even the big not okay sign that IBM computers usually put up when something's wrong. Just a couple of error codes and then nothing. I didn't know if the drive was still the problem, so I went over all my solder joints again and made absolutely sure that everything was kosher. Still no results. About at the end of my rope, I took a close look at the motherboard for absolutely anything out of place, and I noticed that the 387 coprocessor chip was ever so slightly higher in its socket on the bottom than the top, and just slightly out of alignment with the 386 chip next to it. I stuck my fingers under it in an attempt to see if I could just feel any daylight under there, and was surprised to the point of injury by how easily it gave way. What I found were pins just going every which way, because whoever stuck this in the motherboard was an idiot. They seemed to have lined up one corner and just jammed the thing down. It was a horror show. I'd normally have taken a picture, but I was so taken aback that my immediate instinct was to just fix it. You'll have to take my bloodied up finger as evidence. It really did look like a plate of spaghetti under that chip. Who does that? I never would have thought to check for this, but I was at my wit's end looking for any little thing wrong when I just barely noticed the slight chip misalignment from above. I carefully straightened each pin with a tweezer and got it all lined up as well as I could. Then I put it back in properly, making sure to line up each pin. I booted up and boom! I got at least to the proper IBM error page. The coprocessor had previously been detected, but then was freezing the computer. I'm surprised it ever booted up that first time. It must have just not detected the 387 at all, and I probably just bypassed the configuration error message. But now I was making progress. Still an error, but an expected one, and now I could try my reference disk again. But, and you'll probably be seeing a pattern here, no dice. The computer still would not boot the reference disk. I remembered I'd read that PS2 reference disks have an ID number that the disk won't boot without. I'd also read that if you, quote, look at a reference disk in Windows, that ID can be destroyed. Well, I hadn't actually browsed any of my disk images in Windows, but again, having seemingly ruled everything else out, I ran the refstamp utility from DOSBox. It won't work from a 64-bit Windows command prompt. Then I fired up the P70 with the disk in it and... success! I was presented with the P70's best feature, its orange plasma screen in all its glory. This was why I wanted this computer in the first place. See, people are familiar with monochrome monitors, then we had color monitors, then we had LCD screens, which most people think of as color from the start.
While LCD color technology has been available for several years, there were many obstacles to overcome before making the technology commercially practical.
But there were intermediate steps too, with monochrome flat panel displays of various types, though most of these were LCD in either black on white or dark green on slightly lighter green. That's especially true in portable or so-called luggable computers like this one. The P70 is a full desktop computer with a handle on it, and that was back in the days when that would be considered a selling point and a badge of honor.
It's an extremely powerful device, full function desktop portable with a handle on it.
And the retail price also?
The retail price for the 60 megabyte file is $76.95, and for the 120 megabyte file, $82.95.
So IBM threw their absolute best technology into this thing, and that included a gas plasma display. The same technology used in many TVs up until recently, but displaying just a single color, bright orange on black. Now to be clear, this was not the only computer to use a gas plasma display like this. It's just the one I wanted. It's about this time that my floppy drive stopped working again. Intermittently at first, and then finally for good. I took another look at the drive and decided the problem was probably the tracings. There are some possible fixes for this, and I did make an attempt with some conductive tape. But since my multimeter was not identifying any actual break in continuity, I decided it was a wild goose chase, and my best hope at this point was just finding another drive. Now, shopping for a PS2 floppy drive is an adventure unto itself. They're all proprietary, often to just a few machines. A standard floppy will work if you make the right cable, but the eject button won't line up with the case cover or be the right color, and I'm trying to restore this machine to its factory glory. There are supposedly only 2 models specifically made for the P70, although a few others are apparently compatible as well and still look the part. None of them are cheap or easy to come by. It took me a while to find one. Even the few websites out there that claim to have them told me they don't after I contacted them. I did notice that one guy on eBay was selling a P70 case and floppy drive together. The total with shipping was more than $100, which was halfway to what I'd paid for the whole computer, but I figured it couldn't hurt to contact him about just selling the drive. Turns out he actually watches my channel and was more than happy to help. Thanks, dude. I really couldn't have done this without you. Interestingly, while the floppy he sent me clearly did come from a P70, it's a different drive altogether. This one's made by Mitsubishi, whereas my original one was made by Alps. Maybe this one will be more reliable long term. The Mitsubishi drive also has its connector on the opposite side, which made it a little difficult to fit and required me to cut part of the internal clear plastic shielding, but I did finally get it in there. And it boots. Now, if you're wondering why I didn't try a floppy emulator just to get the computer running, I actually did. I spent about a month trying to get a Lotharic HXC working with this machine with a lot of help from its creator, and it just never did, despite the custom cable that I made. I did end up finally buying a cheap Gotek to try to rule in or out the floppy controller itself, and lo and behold, that worked right out of the box, with my custom cable. So, in truth, I did have this computer working just before finding the floppy drive, but only with cables and other bits hanging out the open back. And again, this is a restoration video, not a hacky kludge video. While I was dealing with the floppy issues, I decided to take a look and see what I could do about the hinges. The P70's screen pulls out and angles upward, because on a standard desk it sits a little below eye level. The P70's hinges, though, are made of plastic and are not IBM's most robust design, and mine, like most others by now, have broken through the stress of regular use. Given the scarcity of spare parts and the fact that both the shape and the machined metal parts meant they were not the best candidates for 3D printing, I looked into it. That meant I'd need to try to make do with what I had. Luckily, I still had the broken bits from my left hinge, which had completely shattered at some point in the system's life. Since that also meant the left spring hadn't actually been doing anything all that time, I decided to just take it out to reduce the stress on that hinge. These springs are way too strong for the plastic they're constantly pressing up against. I then just glued the left hinge back together, as well as the less damaged right, which I did replace its spring into, and I reset everything back the way it should be. The overall assembly is probably not as strong as it would have been originally, which wasn't very strong to begin with, but it works, and it's at least straight now when closed. I'll just be a little careful with it. By the way, a little tip for anyone that has one of these. Always close the screen from the bottom or you will break the hinges. Even closing the screen properly feels alarmingly violent, but do it the wrong way and you'll blow up the hinge. Yes, your closing it wrong was probably IBM's support response to this problem. At this point, the repairs were complete and the computer was working. Of course, I cleaned it up too as I was going along. I don't normally show much cleaning in my videos because it's just a standard thing when buying anything used, though I did make a whole video about it if you want to see my general process. I don't mean that people shouldn't do cleaning videos, just that my cleaning never seems that interesting to me. One change I've made recently is using the denture cleaner trick for the keyboard keys, which really does work and saves a ton of time. But otherwise, just some glass cleaner and alcohol on various parts of this machine, and I think it turned out pretty nice. Of course, certain parts are a little yellower than they were originally, but I'm not going to try retrobrighting rubber. So now that it's working, let's boot into DOS here so I can show off some of the computer's features. The previous owner had a ton of software on the 120 megabyte hard drive, and it's all still here. 4 32 megabyte partitions, 2 of which are compressed, and they're all full. Obviously, the thing that attracted me to the P70 is that bright orange screen. Let's start up Windows 3.1 so you can see it in all its glory. I do have to apologize for some of the moire and flickering effects in this video. I did my best, but it's very hard to shoot this screen without picking up some of that. None of it's visible in real life. Here's the Castle desktop background I mentioned in my previous video about this computer. I still think it just looks wild on this screen. And here's Windows 3.1, just as the previous owner left it. I really recommend wiping your computers when you sell them, guys. I'm not going to show any of the previous owner's personal info or documents here, but someone else might not be as scrupulous. But I will show off some of the old software she had, because it's just fun to look at. First, I mentioned that 2 of the partitions were compressed to save space using Stacker. Back in the early 90s, drive compression was the next big thing because you could effectively increase your storage space for free at a time when hard drives still cost close to $10 per megabyte, meaning a 120 megabyte hard drive like this could run more than $1,000. I only used compression for a brief time because I remember it causing all sorts of problems, and you see here that Stacker considers fragmentation of 8% low. But fragmentation in these apps was the big issue that led to data loss. Stacker's got an interesting story behind it. When MS-DOS 6.0 was released, it included a similar disk compression utility called Double Space, using technology licensed from a company called Vertisoft. In fact, it was so similar that the company behind Stacker, Stack Electronics, sued Microsoft and Vertisoft for patent infringement, and they actually won. The companies ended up settling afterwards for MS investing in Stack, paying back royalties, and licensing the technology from Stack going forward. So this is really the compression utility that grew into both double space and drive space. Let's take a look at File Manager to just get a quick overview of what's on all these partitions. Yes, somebody's going to make a joke about there being a game called Hard, which is actually Atari's Hard Drivin'. Here's more stuff on Drive C. There's DOS 3.3, which explains the 32 megabyte partitions. Some personal productivity and work stuff. You see things like FaxWorks, LapLink, and of course here's a games folder that I put on there myself. And we'll be looking at this in a little bit. Here you see Procom and Prodigy, which aren't really possible to use anymore. Okay, maybe Procom is, but I'm not going to test it now. I actually tried Prodigy and it just crashes on the title screen, but there's nothing left to dial into anyway. Back to Drive D, we've got Oracle, which would have been Oracle Database, and that seems to take up most of this partition. Moving on to Drive E, we've got MS Office, and I think this is MS Office 3. Then Windows 3.0, and it seems like 3.1 was installed right into that same folder. There's also another Prodigy here for some reason. I think again that this person had upgraded, and the newer one just got put on another partition. Drive F has a couple games, Tetris and Blockout, which we'll look at later. A couple more Office apps, and Quicken, which is a personal finance software. It's a pretty fully stocked computer for having a 120 megabyte hard drive. Remember, that's megabytes, not gigabytes. Let's fire up MS Word, and then I can give you a little typing demo with this keyboard as well. This was my first version of Word, and I remember it well. I've been told by several people in my comments section that the keyboard uses Alps plate spring switches. They're pretty nice, though the keyboard itself is made to be lightweight for carrying, so it feels flimsier than other IBM keyboards of the era. Let's try Tetris. This seems to be a very early PC version, and it's a DOS game running under Windows. Windows 3.1 was not a good gaming OS. It didn't have many games of its own, and most DOS games wouldn't work under it. If you wanted to play DOS games, you'd just exit Windows, which itself was just a DOS app. But simple games like Tetris could work within Windows. This version seems very difficult, and I don't even know the controls. Whatever. Let's exit out of Windows and play some other games. I like Outrun on PC because it's a good speed test. It came out in 1989 and it's a racing game that runs really smoothly on the right hardware. You'll notice that not just Outrun, but actually all the games I play run letterboxed. My guess is that's because the P70's graphics adapter and screen do no aspect correction, just simple scaling to the native 640 by 480. With a CRT on a different computer, the aspect ratio would be stretched vertically to 4 by 3. That makes this, well, not a great gaming computer for early DOS games that often used these non-standard modes. But on the other hand, everything is crystal clear because there's no stretching. Here's Flight Simulator 3, also letterboxed, but it does run just as smoothly as Outrun, and all those little numbers and symbols are just tack sharp. Clearly this computer had the chops to run games of the era, if you can live with the letterboxing and the lack of a sound card or joystick port. Microchannel sound cards do exist, and this computer has 2 MCA slots, but they're quite rare and expensive. And here's a really cool game called Blockout, one of the various 3D Tetris pseudo-sequels of the time. You can see that it actually specifies that it's running in 640 by 350 EGA. How cool is this though, with those wireframe graphics on this orange plasma screen? This is 80s retrofuturism in action right here. If you ever do feel your rods and cones getting screwed up by peak orange, or you just want full color for a while, well, the P70 can do that too. It has a 14-pin VGA connector, and yes, I said 14-pin. So you can connect to the VGA monitor of your choice and get full 640 by 480 16-color graphics. It unfortunately won't run both displays at the same time, so you can't use a dual monitor setup. You need to pick one or the other. This was a very early VGA machine, so you do need a 14-pin cable or adapter, and a monitor that doesn't require that extra pin to report its resolutions back to the VGA card. That rules out a lot of later VGA LCD screens, although luckily I have one that can handle the P70 with an adapter. Unfortunately, this monitor seems to want to fill the width of its 16 by 9 screen regardless of resolution and regardless of settings. But hey, it still works as a demo. So here's Outrun again, and it's hard to notice it's even stretched. It almost looks like it's supposed to be 16 by 9. I think it looks really good. It's interesting that it's filling the whole screen, whereas it was letterboxed on the P70 display. That would imply that the P70 is outputting some sort of 4x3 mode over its external port, and the monitor is stretching it. And here's Flight Sim 3. This is more like what I'd expect the output to look like. It looks like the P70 is outputting 640 by 350 and the monitor is further stretching it. Here's Blockout again, also definitely running at 640 by 350. I don't think this looks nearly as cool as it does in the P70's native orange. And why not, let's just check out Windows in full color. It almost looks strange to me like this now. One interesting thing about monochrome monitors of any color is that your brain seems to tune to it after a while. I had a green monitor as a kid, and after a while I just no longer noticed it. The same thing happens with orange, and then full color seems weird. Lastly, let's just run one more thing on the internal display, because somebody's going to ask me if you can run Doom on this machine, and I have a feeling it's going to look pretty amazing on gas plasma. Let's find out. So, yes, you can run it, though whether you'd want to is another question. Doom really likes a 486 or higher, which is what I first played it on, and it's a lot better with a sound card, but I could probably play it like this if a 386 was all I had. Frame rates like this were just something a lot of us had to put up with in those days, because the gulf between the fastest and slowest computers was far more vast than it is today, and games weren't as good at scaling speeds. There are some options in Doom, but they don't make much difference on this machine. There's just something really fitting about playing Doom on this orange screen though. Funnily enough, you'll notice that the graphics adapter turns anything that's the color red black. I'm guessing because you wouldn't even be able to see it otherwise. I did watch some other videos of this machine just to make sure nothing was wrong with mine, and it seems to be normal behavior for it. Overall, I love the design of this machine, and if I'd bought one when it was first available, I'd have felt I got my money's worth, even at a price literally as high as a new car. And the fact is, these were meant to live a hard life, and not one this long. Still, if you're thinking of buying one today, you should know that they're almost inherently problematic between their floppy drives and hinges. But mine's working now, and it's a satisfying ending to what became a long-running project.